Chapter 33 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Ken Tischler of Hammond, Louisiana. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 33. So I started for town in the wagon, and when I was halfway, I see a wagon comin', and sure enough it was Tom Sawyer, and I stopped and waited till he come along. I says, "Hold on," and it stopped alongside, and his mouth opened up like a trunk, and stayed so, and he swallowed 2 or 3 times like a person that's got a dry throat, and then says, "I hain't ever done you no harm, you know that. So then, what you want to come back and haunt me for?" I says, "I hain't come back. I ain't been gone." When he heard my voice, it righted him up some, but he warn't quite satisfied yet. He says, "Don't you play nothing on me, because I wouldn't on you. Honest Injun, you ain't a ghost?" "Honest Injun, I ain't," I says. "Well, well, that ought to settle it, of course, but I can't somehow seem to understand it, no way. Looky here, weren't you ever murdered at all?" "No, I weren't ever murdered at all. I played it on them. You come in here and feel of me if you don't believe me." So he done it, and it satisfied him, and he was that glad to see me again he didn't know what to do, and he wanted to know all about it right off, because it was a grand adventure and mysterious, and so it hit him where he lived. But I said, leave it alone till by and by, and told his driver to wait, and we drove off a little piece, and I told him the kind of fix I was in, and what did he reckon we better do. He said, let him alone a minute, and don't disturb him. So he thought, and pretty soon he said, "It's all right. I've got it. Take my trunk and your wagon, and let on it's yourn. And you turn back and fool along slow, so as to get to the house about the time you ought to, and I'll go towards town a piece and take a fresh start, and get there a quarter or a half hour after you, and you needn't let on to know me at first." I says, "All right, but wait a minute. There's one more thing, a thing that nobody don't know but me, and that is, there's a nigger here that I'm a-trying to steal out of slavery, and his name is Jim, old Miss Watson's Jim." He says, "What? Why, Jim is—" He stopped and went to studying. I says, "I know what you'll say. You'll say it's a dirty low-down business, but what if it is? I'm low down, and I'm a-going to steal him, and I want you to keep mum and not let on, will you?" His eyes lit up, and he says, "I'll help you steal him." Well, I let go all holts then, like I was shot. It was the most astonishing speech I ever heard, and I'm bound to say Tom Sawyer fell considerable in my estimation. Only I couldn't believe it. Tom Sawyer, a nigger stealer. "Oh, shucks," I says, "you're joking." "I ain't joking either." "Well then," I says, "joking or no joking, if you hear anything said about a runaway nigger, don't forget to remember that you don't know nothing about him, and I don't know nothing about him." Then we took the trunk and put it in my wagon, and he drove off his way and I drove mine. But of course I forgot all about driving slow, on accounts of being glad and full of thinking, so I got home a heap too quick for the length of the trip. The old gentleman was at the door, and he said, "Why, this is wonderful. Whoever would have thought it was in that mare to do it? I wish we'd a timed her, and she hain't sweated a hair, not a hair. It's wonderful. Why, I wouldn't take $100 for that horse now. I wouldn't, honest. And yet I'd have sold her for 15 before, and thought 'twas all she was worth." That's all he said. He was the innocentest, best old soul I ever see. But it warn't surprising, because he weren't only just a farmer, he was a preacher too, and had a little 1-horse log church down back of the plantation, which he built himself at his own expense, for a church and schoolhouse, and never charged nothing for his preaching, and it was worth it too. There was plenty other farmer preachers like that, and done the same way, down south. In about half an hour Tom's wagon drove up to the front stile, and Aunt Sally, she see it through the window, because it was only about 50 yards, and says, "Why, there's somebody come.
I wonder who it is. Why, I do believe it's a stranger. Jimmy, that's one of the children, run and tell Lize to put on another plate for dinner." Everybody made a rush for the front door, because, of course, a stranger don't come every year, and so he lays over the yaller fever for interest when he does come. Tom was over the stile and starting for the house. The wagon was spinning up the road for the village, and we was all bunched in the front door. Tom had his store clothes on, and an audience, and that was always nuts for Tom Sawyer. In them circumstances, it warn't no trouble to him to throw in an amount of style that was suitable. He warn't a boy to meeky along up that yard like a sheep. No, he come calm and important like the ram. When he got a front of us, he lifts his hat ever so gracious and dainty, like it was the lid of a box that had butterflies asleep in it, and he didn't want to disturb them, and says, "Mr. Archibald Nichols, I presume?" "No, my boy," says the old gentleman. "I'm sorry to say your driver has deceived you. Nichols' place is down a matter of 3 mile more. Come in, come in." Tom, he took a look back over his shoulder and says, "Too late, he's out of sight." "Yes, he's gone, my son, and you must come in and eat your dinner with us, and then we'll hitch up and take you down to Nichols's." "Oh, I can't make you so much trouble. I couldn't think of it. I'll walk. I don't mind the distance." "But we won't let you walk. It wouldn't be Southern hospitality to do it. Come right in." "Oh, do," says Aunt Sally. "It ain't a bit of trouble to us, not a bit in the world. You must stay. It's a long, dusty 3 mile, and we can't let you walk. And besides, I've already told 'em to put on another plate when I see you coming, so you mustn't disappoint us. Come right in and make yourself at home." So Tom, he thanked them very hearty and handsome, and let himself be persuaded, and come in. And when he was in, he said he was a stranger from Hicksville, Ohio, and his name was William Thompson, and he made another bow. Well, he run on, and on, and on, making up stuff about Hicksville and everybody in it he could invent, and I was getting a little nervous, and wondering how this was going to help me out of my scrape. And at last, still talking along, he reached over and kissed Aunt Sally right on the mouth, and then settled back again in his chair comfortable, and was going on talking. But she jumped up and wiped it off with the back of her hand and says, "You audacious puppy!" He looked kind of hurt and says, "I'm surprised at you, ma'am." "You're Why, what do you reckon I am? I've a good notion to take and... Say, what do you mean by kissing me?" He looked kind of humble and says, "I didn't mean nothing, ma'am. I didn't mean no harm. I thought you'd like it." "Why, you born fool!" She took up the spinning stick, and it looked like it was all she could do to keep from giving him a crack with it. "What made you think I'd like it?" "Well, I don't know. Only they told me you would." "They told you I would? Whoever told you's another lunatic. I never heard the beat of it. Who's they?" "Why, everybody. They all said so, ma'am." It was all she could do to hold in, and her eyes snapped, and her fingers worked like she wanted to scratch him, and she says, "Who's everybody? Out with their names, or they'll be an idiot short." He got up and looked distressed, and fumbled his hat, and says, "I'm sorry, and I weren't expecting it. They told me to. They all told me to. They all said, 'Kiss her,' and said she'd like it. They all said it, every one of them. But I'm sorry, ma'am, and I won't do it no more. I won't, honest." "You won't you? Well, I should reckon you won't." "No'm, I'm honest about it. I won't ever do it again, till you ask me." "Till I ask you? Well, I never see the beat of it in my born days. I lay you'll be the Methuselah numbskull of creation before ever I ask you, or the likes of you." "Well," he says, "it does surprise me so. I can't make it out somehow. They said you would, and I thought you would. But—" He stopped and looked around slow, like he wished he could run across a friendly eye somewheres, and fetched up on the old gentleman and says, "Didn't you think she'd like me to kiss her, sir?" "Why, no, well, no, I believe I didn't." Then he looks around the same way to me and says, Tom, didn't you think Aunt Sally'd open out her arms and say, "Sid Sawyer"? "My land," she says, breaking in and jumping for him, "you impudent young rascal, to fool a body so," and was going to hug him, but he fended her off and says, "No, not till you've asked me first." So she didn't lose no time, but asked him, and hugged him, and kissed him over and over again, and then turned him over to the old man, and he took what was left. And after they got a little quiet again, she says, "Why, dear me, I never see such a surprise. We weren't looking for you at all, but only Tom. Sis never wrote to me about anybody coming but him." "It's because it weren't intended for any of us to come but Tom," he says. "But I begged and begged, and at the last minute she let me come too. So coming down the river, me and Tom thought it would be a first-rate surprise for him to come here to the house first, and for me to by and by tag along and drop in and let on to be a stranger. But it was a mistake, Aunt Sally. This ain't no healthy place for a stranger to come." "No, not impudent whelp, Sid. You ought to had your jaws boxed. I hain't been so put out since I don't know when. But I don't care. I don't mind the terms. I'd be willing to stand 1,000 such jokes to have you here. Well, to think of that performance. I don't deny it. I was most putrefied with astonishment when you gave me that smack." We had dinner out in that broad open passage betwixt the house and the kitchen, and there was things enough on that table for 7 families, and all hot too. None of your flabby, tough meat that's laid in a cupboard in a damp cellar all night and tastes like a hunk of old cold cannibal in the morning. Uncle Silas, he asked a pretty long blessing over it, but it was worth it, and it didn't cool it a bit neither, the way I've seen them kind of interruptions do lots of times. There was a considerable good deal of talk all the afternoon, and me and Tom was on the lookout all the time, but it warn't no use. They didn't happen to say nothing about any runaway nigger, and we was afraid to try to work up to it. But at supper, at night, one of the little boys says, "Pa, mayn't Tom and Sid and me go to the show?" "No," says the old man. "I reckon there ain't gonna be any, and you couldn't go if there was, because the runaway nigger told Burton and me all about that scandalous show, and Burton said he would tell the people, so I reckon they've drove the audacious loafers out of town before this time." So there it was, but I couldn't help it. Tom and me was to sleep in the same room and bed, so, being tired, we bid good night and went up to bed right after supper, and clumb out the window and down the lightning rod, and shoved for the town. For I didn't believe anybody was going to give the king and the duke a hint, and so if I didn't hurry up and give them one, they'd get into trouble sure. On the road, Tom he told me all about how it was reckoned I was murdered, and how Pap disappeared pretty soon, and didn't come back no more, and what a stir there was when Jim run away. And I told Tom all about our royal none-such rapscallions, and as much of the raft voyage as I had time to, and as we struck into town and up through the here comes a raging rush of people with torches, and an awful whooping and yelling, and banging tin pans and blowing horns. And we jumped to one side to let them go by. And as they went by, I see that they had the king and the duke astraddle of a rail. That is, I knowed it was the king and the duke, though they was all over tar and feathers, and didn't look like nothing in the world that was human. Just looked like a couple of monstrous big soldier plumes. Well, it made me sick to see it, and I was sorry for them poor pitiful rascals. It seemed like I couldn't ever feel any hardness against them any more in the world. It was a dreadful thing to see. Human beings can be awful cruel to one another. We see we was too late, couldn't do no good. We asked some stragglers about it, and they said everybody went to the show looking very innocent, and laid low and kept dark till the poor old king was in the middle of his cavortings on the stage. Then somebody give the signal, and the house rose up and went for it. So we poked along back home, and I warn't feeling so brash as I was before, but kind of ornery and humble, and to blame somehow, though I hadn't done nothing. But that's always the way. It don't make no difference whether you do right or wrong. A person's conscience ain't got no sense, and just goes for him anyway. If I had a yaller dog that didn't know no more than a person's conscience does, I would poison him. It takes up more room than all the rest of a person's insides, and yet ain't no good, nohow. Tom Sawyer, he says the same. End of chapter 33. Recording by Ken Tischler of Hammond, Louisiana. Of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Ken Tischler of Hammond, Louisiana. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 34. We stopped talking and got to thinking. By and by Tom says, "Looky here, Huck, what fools we are not to think of it before. I bet I know where Jim is." "No, where?" "In that hut down by the ash hopper. Why, looky here, when we was at dinner, didn't you see a nigger man go in there with some victuals?" "Yes." "What did you think the victuals was for?" "For a dog." "So'd I." "Well, it wasn't for a dog." "Why?" "Because part of it was watermelon." "So it was. I noticed it. Well, it does beat all that I never thought about a dog not eating watermelon. Shows how a body can see and don't see at the same time." "Well, the nigger unlocked the padlock when he went in, and he locked it up again when he came out. He fetched Uncle a key about the same time we got up from table. Same key, I bet. Watermelon shows man, lock shows prisoner. And it ain't likely there's two prisoners on such a little plantation, and where the people's all so kind and good. Jim's the prisoner. All right. I'm glad we found it out detective fashion. I wouldn't give shucks for any other way. Now, you work your mind and study out a plan to steal Jim, and I will study one out too, and we'll take the one we like the best." What a head for just a boy to have! If I had Tom Sawyer's head, I wouldn't trade it off to be a duke, nor mate of a steamboat, nor clown in a circus, nor nothing else I can think of. I went to thinking out a plan, but only just to be doing something. I'd knowed very well where the right plan was going to come from. Pretty soon Tom says, "Ready?" "Yes," I says. "All right, bring it out." "My plan is this," I says. "We can easy find out if it's Jim in there. Then get up my canoe tomorrow night and fetch my raft over from the island. Then, the first dark night that comes, steal the key out of the old man's britches after he goes to bed, and shove off down the river on the raft with Jim, hiding daytimes and running nights, the way me and Jim used to do before. Wouldn't that plan work?" "Work? Why, certainly it would work, like rats a-fighting. But it's too blame simple. There ain't nothing to it. What's the good of a plan that ain't no more trouble than that? It's as mild as goose milk. Why, Huck, it wouldn't make no more talk than breaking into a soap factory." I never said nothing, because I warn't expecting nothing different. But I knowed mighty well that whenever he got his plan ready, it wouldn't have none of them objections to it. And it didn't. He told me what it was, and I see in a minute it was worth 15 of mine for style, and would make Jim just as free a man as mine would, and maybe get us all killed besides. So I was satisfied, and said we would waltz in on it. I needn't tell what it was here, because I knowed it wouldn't stay that way. It was. I knowed he would be changing it around every which way as we went along, and heaving in new bulliness whenever he got a chance. And that is what he done. Well, one thing was dead sure, and that was that Tom Sawyer was in earnest, and was actually going to help steal that nigger out of slavery. That was the thing that was too many for me. Here was a boy that was respectable and well brung up, and had a character to lose, and folks at home that had characters, and he was bright and not leather-headed, and knowing and not ignorant, and not mean but kind, and yet here he was, without any more pride or rightness or feeling than to stoop to this business and make himself ashamed and his family ashamed before everybody. I couldn't understand it no way at all. It was outrageous, and I knowed I ought to just up and tell him so be his true friend, and let him quit the thing right there where he was and save himself. And I did start to tell him, but he shut me up and says, "Don't you reckon I know what I'm about? Don't I generally know what I'm about?" "Yes." Didn't I say I was going to help steal the nigger? Yes. Well, then. That's all he said, and that's all I said. It warn't no use to say any more, because when he said he'd do a thing, he'd always done it. But I couldn't make out how he was willing to go into this thing, so I just let it go, and never bothered no more about it. If he was bound to have it so, I couldn't help it. When we got home, the house was all dark and still, so we went on down to the hut by the ash hopper for to examine it. We went through the yard so as to see what the hounds would do. They knowed us and didn't make no more noise than country dogs is always doing when anything comes by in the night. When we got to the cabin, we took a look at the front and the two sides, and on the side I warn't acquainted with, which was the north side, we found a square window hole up tolerable high, with just one stout board nailed across it. I says, "Here's the ticket. This hole's big enough for Jim to get through if we wrench off the board." Tom says, "It's as simple as tit-tat-toe, 3 in a row, and as easy as playing hooky. I should hope we can find a way that's a little more complicated than that, Huck Finn." "Well then," I says, "how'll it do to saw him out, the way I done before I was murdered that time?" "That's more like it," he says. "It's real mysterious and troublesome, and good," he said. "But I bet we can find a way that's twice as long. There ain't no hurry. Let's keep on looking around." Betwixt the hut and the fence on the back side was a lean-to that joined the hut at the eaves and was made out of plank. It was as long as the hut, but narrow, only about 6 foot wide. The door to it was at the south end and was padlocked. Tom, he went to the soap kettle and searched around and fetched back the iron thing they lift the lid with, so he took it and prized out one of the staples. The chain fell down, and we opened the door and went in, and shut it and struck a match, and see the shed was only built against a cabin and hadn't no connection with it, and there warn't no floor to the shed, nor nothing in it but some old rusty played-out hoes and spades and picks and a crippled plow. The match went out, and so did we, and shoved in the staple again, and the door was locked as good as ever. Tom was joyful. He says, "Now we're all right. We'll dig him out. It'll take about a week." Then we started for the house, and I went in the back door. You only have to pull a buckskin latch string. They don't fasten the doors. But that warn't romantical enough for Tom Sawyer. No way would do him, but he must climb up the lightning rod. But after he got up halfway about 3 times, and missed fire and fell every time, and the last time most busted his brains out, he thought he'd got to give it up. But after he was rested, he allowed he would give her one more turn for luck, and this time he made the trip. In the morning we was up at break of day, and down to the nigger cabins to pet the dogs and make friends with the nigger that fed Jim, if it was Jim that was being fed. The niggers was just getting through breakfast and starting for the fields, and Jim's nigger was piling up a tin pan with bread and meat and things, and whilst the others was leaving, the key come from the house. This nigger had a good-natured, chuckle-headed face, and his wool was all tied up in little bunches with thread. That was to keep the witches off. He said the witches was pestering him awful these nights, and making him see all kinds of strange things, and hear all kinds of strange words and noises, and he didn't believe he was ever witched so long before in his life. He got so worked up, and got to running on so about his troubles, he forgot all about what he'd been a-going to do. So Tom says, "What's the victuals for? Going to feed the dogs?" The nigger kind of smiled around gradually over his face, like when you heave a brickbat in a mud puddle, and he says, "Yes, Boss Sid, a dog. Curious dog, too. Does you want to go and look at him?" "Yes." I hunts Tom and whispers, "You going? Right here in the daybreak? That warn't the plan." "No, it warn't, but it's the plan now." So, drat him, we went along, and I didn't like it much. When we got in, we couldn't hardly see anything, it was so dark. But Jim was there, sure enough, and could see us, and he sings out, "Why, Huck, and good land, ain't that Mr. Tom?" I just knowed how it would be. I just expected it. I didn't know nothing to do, and if I had I couldn't have done it, because that nigger busted in and says, "Why, de gracious sakes, do he know you gentlemen?" We could see pretty well now. Tom, he looked at the nigger steady and kind of wondering, and says, Does who know us? Why, this your runaway nigger. I don't reckon he does, but what put that into your head? What put it there? Didn't he just this minute sing out like he knowed you? Tom says in a puzzled up kind of way, well, that's mighty curious. Who sung out? When did he sing out? What did he sing out? And turns to me perfectly calm and says, did you hear anybody sing out? Of course there weren't nothing to be said but the one thing, so I says, no, I ain't heard nobody say nothing. Then he turns to Jim and looks him over like he never seen him before and says, did you sing out? No, sir, says Jim. I ain't said nothing, sir. Not a word? No, sir, I ain't said a word. Did you ever see us before? No, sir, not as I knows on. So Tom turns to the nigger, which was looking wild and distressed, and says, kind of severe, what do you reckon's the matter with you anyway? What made you think somebody sung out? Oh, it's the dad blame witches, sir, and I wisht I was dead, I do. Dey's allers at it, sir, and they do most kill me. They scares me so. Please to don't tell nobody about it, sir, or old Mars Silas he'll scold me, 'cause he say they ain't no witches. I just wish to goodness he was here now. Then what would he say? I just bet he couldn't find no way to get around it this time. But it's allers just so. People's dat sot, stays sot. They won't look into nothing and find it out for theirselves, and when you find it out and you tell 'em about it, they don't believe you. Tom gave him a dime and said we wouldn't tell nobody, and told him to buy some more thread to tie up his wool with, and then looks at Jim and says, I wonder if Uncle Silas is going to hang this nigger. If I was to catch a nigger that was ungrateful enough to run away, I wouldn't give him up. I'd hang him. And whilst the nigger stepped to the door to look at the dime and bite it to see if it was good, he whispers to Jim and says, don't ever let on to know us, and if you hear any digging going on nights, it's us. We're going to set you free. Jim only had time to grab us by the hand and squeeze it. Then the nigger come back and said we'd come again sometime if the nigger wanted us to, and he said he would, more particular if it was dark, because the witches went for him mostly in the dark, and it was good to have folks around then. End of chapter 34. Recording by Ken Tischler of Hammond, Louisiana.
Chapter 35 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 35. It would be most an hour yet till breakfast, so we left and struck down into the woods, because Tom said we got to have some light to see how to dig by, and a lantern makes too much and might get us into trouble. What we must have was a lot of them rotten chunks that's called foxfire, and just makes a soft kind of a glow when you lay them in a dark place. We fetched an armful and hid it in the weeds, and sat down to rest, and Tom says, kind of dissatisfied, blame it, this whole thing is just as easy and awkward as it can be, and so it makes it so rotten difficult to get up a difficult plan. There ain't no watchman to be drugged, now there ought to be a watchman. There ain't even a dog to give a sleeping mixture to, and there's Jim chained by one leg with a 10-foot chain to the leg of his bed. Why, all you got to do is to lift up the bedstead and slip off the chain. And Uncle Silas, he trusts everybody, sends the key to the punkin-headed nigger, and don't send nobody to watch the nigger. Jim could have got out of that window hole before this, only there wouldn't be no use trying to travel with a 10-foot chain on his leg. Why, drat it, Huck, it's the stupidest arrangement I ever see. You got to invent all the difficulties. Well, we can't help it. We got to do the best we can with the materials we've got. Anyhow, there is one thing. There's more honor in getting him out through a lot of difficulties and dangers, where there weren't one of them furnished to you by the people who it was their duty to furnish them, and you had to contrive them all out of your own head. Now look at just that one thing of the lantern. When you come down to the cold facts, we simply got to let on that a lantern's risky. Why, we could work with a torchlight procession if we wanted to, I believe. Now, whilst I think of it, we got to hunt up something to make a saw out of the first chance we get. What do we want of a saw? What do we want of a saw? Hain't we got to saw the leg of Jim's bed off so as to get the chain loose? Why, you just said a body could lift up the bedstead and slip the chain off. Well, if that ain't just like you, Huck Finn. You can get up the infant schooliest ways of going at a thing. Why, hain't you ever read any books at all? Baron Trenck, nor Casanova, nor Benvenuto Cellini, nor Henry IV, nor none of them are heroes? Who ever heard of getting a prisoner loose in such an old matey way as that? No, the way all the best authorities does it is to saw the bed leg in two, and leave it just so, and swallow the sawdust so it can't be found, and put some dirt and grease around the sawed place so the very keenest senescal can't see no sign of its being sawed, and thinks the bed leg is perfectly sound. Then, the night you're ready, fetch the leg a kick. Down she goes, slip off your chain, and there you are. Nothing to do but hitch your rope ladder to the battlements, shin down it, break your leg in the moat, because a rope ladder is 19 foot too short, you know. And there's your horses and your trusty vassals, and they scoop you up and fling you across the saddle, and away you go to your native Languedoc or Navarre or wherever it is. It's gaudy, Huck. I wish there was a moat to this cabin. If we get time the night of the escape, we'll dig one. I says, what do we want of a moat when we're going to snake him out from under the cabin? But he never heard me. He had forgot me and everything else. He had his chin in his hand, thinking. Pretty soon he sighs and shakes his head, then sighs again and says, no, it wouldn't do. There ain't necessity enough for it. For what? I says. Why, to saw Jim's leg off, he says. Good land, I says. Why, there ain't no necessity for it. And what would you want to saw his leg off for, anyway? Well, some of the best authorities has done it. They couldn't get the chain off, so they just cut their hand off and shoved, and a leg would be better still. But we got to let that go. There ain't necessity enough in this case. And besides, Jim's a nigger, and wouldn't understand the reasons for it, and how it's the custom in Europe, so we'll let it go. But there's one thing. He can have a rope ladder. We can tear up our sheets and make him a rope ladder easy enough. And we can send it to him in a pie. It's mostly done that way. And I've had worse pies. Why, Tom Sawyer, how you talk, I says. Jim ain't got no use for a rope ladder. He has got use for it. How you talk, you better say. You don't know nothing about it. He's got to have a rope ladder. They all do. What in the nation can he do with it? Do with it? He can hide it in his bed, can't he? That's what they all do, and he's got to, too. Huck, you don't ever seem to want to do anything that's regular. You want to be starting something fresh all the time. S'pose he don't do nothing with it. Ain't it there in his bed for a clue after he's gone? And don't you reckon they'll want clues? Of course they will. And you wouldn't leave them any. That would be a pretty howdy-do, wouldn't it? I never heard of such a thing. Well, I says, if it's in the regulations and he's got to have it, all right, let him have it, because I don't wish to go back on no regulations. But there's one thing, Tom Sawyer, if we go to tearing up our sheets to make Jim a rope ladder, we're going to get into trouble with Aunt Sally just as sure as you're born. Now, the way I look at it, a hickory bark ladder don't cost nothin', and don't waste nothin', and it's just as good to load up a pie with, and hide in a straw tick, as any rag ladder you can start. And as for Jim, he ain't had no experience, and so he don't care what kind of a... Oh, shucks, Huck Finn, if I was as ignorant as you, I'd keep still, that's what I'd do. Who ever heard of a state prisoner escaping by a hickory bark ladder? Why, it's perfectly ridiculous. Well, all right, Tom, fix it your own way. But if you'll take my advice, you'll let me borrow a sheet off of the clothesline. He said that would do, and that gave him another idea. And he says, borrow a shirt, too. What do we want of a shirt, Tom? Want it for Jim to keep a journal on. Journal your granny. Jim can't write." "S'pose he can't write. He can make marks on the shirt, can't he, if we make him a pen out of an old pewter spoon or a piece of an old iron barrel hoop?" "Why, Tom, we can pull a feather out of a goose and make him a better one, and quicker, too." "Prisoners don't have geese running around the dungeon to pull pens out of, you muggins. They always make their pens out of the hardest, toughest, troublesomest piece of old brass candlestick or something like that they can get their hands on. And it takes them weeks and months to file it out, too, because they've got to do it by rubbing it on the wall. They wouldn't use a goose quill if they had it. It ain't regular." "Well, then, what'll we make him the ink out of?" "Many makes it out of iron rust and tears, but that's the common sort and women. The best authorities uses their own blood. Jim can do that, and when he wants to send any little common ordinary mysterious message to let the world know where he's captivated, he can write it on the bottom of a tin plate with a fork and throw it out of the window. The Iron Mask always done that, and it's a blame good way, too. Jim ain't got no tin plates. They feed him in a pan." "That ain't nothin'. We can get him some." "Can't nobody read his plates?" "That ain't got anything to do with it, Huck Finn. All he's got to do is to write on the plate and throw it out. You don't have to be able to read it. Why, half the time you can't read anything a prisoner writes on a tin plate or anywhere else." "Well, then, what's the sense in wasting the plates?" "Why, blame it all, it ain't the prisoner's plates." "But it's somebody's plates, ain't it?" "Well, s'posen it is. What does the prisoner care who's—" He broke off there because we heard the breakfast horn blowing, so we cleared out for the house. Along during the morning I borrowed a sheet and a white shirt off of the clothesline, and I found an old sack and put them in it, and we went down and got the foxfire and put that in too. I called it borrowing, because that's what Pap always called it, but Tom said it weren't borrowing, it was stealing. He said we was representing prisoners, and prisoners don't care how they get a thing, so they get it. And nobody don't blame them for it, either. It ain't no crime in a prisoner to steal the thing he needs to get away with, Tom said. It's his right, and so, as long as we was representing a prisoner, we had a perfect right to steal anything on this place we had the least use for to get ourselves out of prison with. He said if we warn't prisoners it would be a very different thing, and nobody but a mean, ornery person would steal when he warn't a prisoner. So we allowed we would steal everything there was that come handy. And yet he made a mighty fuss one day after that when I stole a watermelon out of the nigger patch and eat it. And he made me go and give the niggers a dime without telling them what it was for. Tom said that what he meant was we could steal anything we needed. Well, I says, I needed the watermelon. But he said I didn't need it to get out of prison with. There's where the difference was. He said if I'd a wanted it to hide a knife in and smuggle it to Jim to kill the seneschal with, it would 'a been all right. So I let it go at that, though I couldn't see no advantage in my representing a prisoner if I got to set down and chaw over a lot of gold leaf distinctions like that every time I see a chance to hog a watermelon. Well, as I was saying, we waited that morning till everybody was settled down to business, and nobody in sight around the yard. Then Tom he carried the sack into the lean-to, whilst I stood off a piece to keep watch. By and by he come out, and we went and sat down on the wood-pile to talk. He says, everything's all right now except tools, and that's easy fixed. Tools? I says. Yes. Tools for what? Why, to dig with. We ain't a-going to gnaw him out, are we? Ain't them old crippled picks and things in there good enough to dig a nigger out with? I says. He turns on me, looking pity enough to make a body cry, and says, Huck Finn, did you ever hear of a prisoner having picks and shovels and all the modern conveniences in his wardrobe to dig himself out with? Now I want to ask you if you got any reasonableness in you at all. What kind of a show would that give him to be a hero? Why, they might as well lend him the key and done with it. Picks picks and shovels! Why, they wouldn't furnish 'em to a king!" "Well, then," I says, "if we don't want the picks and shovels, what do we want?" "A couple of case knives." "To dig the foundations out from under that cabin with?" "Yes." "Confound it, it's foolish, Tom." "It don't make no difference how foolish it is. It's the right way, and it's the regular way. And there ain't no other way that ever I heard of, and I've read all the books that gives any information about these things. They always dig out with a case knife, and not through dirt, mind you. Generally it's through solid rock. And it takes them weeks and weeks and weeks and forever and ever. Why, look at one of them prisoners in the bottom dungeon of the Castle Death in the harbour of Marseilles that dug himself out that way. How long was he at it, you reckon?" "I don't know." "Well, guess." "I don't know. A month and a half." 37 year, and he come out in China. That's the kind. I wish the bottom of this fortress was solid rock." "Jim don't know nobody in China." "What's that got to do with it?" "Neither did that other fellow, but you're always a wandering off on a side issue. Why can't you stick to the main point?" "All right, I don't care where he comes out, so he comes out. And Jim don't either, I reckon. But there's one thing, anyway. Jim's too old to be dug out with a case knife. He won't last." "Yes, he will last, too. You don't reckon it's going to take 37 years to dig out through a dirt foundation, do you?" "How long will it take, Tom?" "Well, we can't risk being as long as we ought to, because it mayn't take very long for Uncle Silas to hear from down there by New Orleans. He'll hear Jim ain't from there. Then his next move will be to advertise Jim or something like that. So we can't risk being as long digging him out as we ought to. By rights, I reckon we ought to be a couple of years, but we can't. Things being so uncertain, what I recommend is this: that we really dig right in as quick as we can, and after that we can let on to ourselves that we was at it 37 years. Then we can snatch him out and rush him away the first time there's an alarm. Yes, I reckon that'll be the best way." "Now there's sense in that," I says. "Letting on don't cost nothing. Letting on ain't no trouble. And if it's any object, I don't mind letting on we was at it 150 year. It wouldn't strain me none after I got my hand in. So I'll mosey along now and smooch a couple of case knives." "Smooch 3, he says. "We want one to make a saw out of." "Tom, if it ain't unregular and irreligious to suggest it," I says, "there's an old rusty saw blade around yonder sticking under the weatherboarding behind the smokehouse." He looked kind of weary and discouraged like, and says, "It ain't no use to try to learn you nothing, Huck. Run along and smooch the knives, 3 of them." So I done it. End of chapter 35.
Number 36 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Father Ziley. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 36. As soon as we reckoned everybody was asleep that night, we went down to Lightning Rod and shut ourselves up in the lean-to and got out our pile of foxfire and went to work. We cleared everything out of the way, about 4 or 5 foot along the middle of the bottom log. Tom said he was right behind Jim's bed now, and we'd dig in under it, and when we got through there couldn't nobody in the cabin ever know there was any hole there, because Jim's counterpin hung down most to the ground, and you'd have to raise it up and look under to see the hole. So we dug and dug with the case knives till most midnight, and then we was dog-tired, and our hands was blistered, and yet you couldn't see we'd done anything hardly. At last I says, This ain't no 37-year job. This is a 38-year job, Tom Sawyer." He never said nothing, but he sighed, and pretty soon he stopped digging. And then for a good little while I knowed he was thinking. Then he says, "Ain't no use, Huck. It ain't a-goin' to work. If we was prisoners it would, because then we'd have as many years as we wanted and no hurry, and we wouldn't get but a few minutes to dig every day while they was changing watches, and so our hands wouldn't get blistered, and we could keep it up right along, year in and year out, and do it right, and the way it ought to be done. But we can't fool along. We got to rush. We ain't got no time to spare. If we was to put in another night this way, we'd have to knock off for a week to let our hands get well. Couldn't touch a case knife with them sooner." "Well, then, what we going to do, Tom?" "I'll tell you. It ain't right, and it ain't moral, and I wouldn't like to get it out, but there ain't only just the one way. We got to dig him out with the picks and let on it's case knives." "Now you're talking," I says. "Your head gets leveler and leveler all the time, Tom Sawyer," I says. "Picks is the thing, moral or no moral, and as for me, I don't care shucks for the morality of it nohow. When I start in to steal a nigger or a watermelon or a Sunday school book, I ain't no ways particular how it's done, or so is it's done. What I want is my nigger, or what I want is my watermelon, or what I want is my Sunday school book. And if a pick's the handiest thing, that's the thing I'm a-goin' to dig that nigger or that watermelon or that Sunday school book out with. And I don't give a dead rat what the authorities thinks about it, nuther." "Well," he says, "there's excuse for picks and letting on in a case like this. If it warn't so, I wouldn't approve of it, nor I wouldn't stand by and see the rules broke. Because right is right, and wrong is wrong, and a body ain't got no business doing wrong when he ain't ignorant and knows better. It might answer for you to dig Jim out with a pick without any letting on, because you don't know no better, but it wouldn't for me, because I do know better. Give me a case knife." He had his own by him, but I handed him mine. He flung it down and says, "Give me a case knife." I didn't know just what to do. But then I thought. I scratched around amongst the old tools and got a pickaxe and give it to him, and he took it and went to work and never said a word. He was always just that particular, full of principle. So then I got a shovel, and then we picked and shoveled, turned about, and made the fur fly. We stuck to it about half an hour, which was as long as we could stand up. But we had a good deal of a hole to show for it. When I got upstairs, I looked out at the window and see Tom doing his level best with the lightning rod, but he couldn't come it. His hands was so sore. At last he says, "It ain't no use. It can't be done. What do you reckon I better do? Can't you think of no way?" "Yes," I says, "but I reckon it ain't regular. Come up the stairs and let on it's a lightning rod." So he done it. Next day Tom stole a pewter spoon and a brass candlestick in the house for to make some pens for Jim out of, and 6 tallow candles, and I hung around the nigger cabins and laid for a chance, and stole 3 tin plates. Tom says it wasn't enough, but I said nobody wouldn't never see the plates that Jim throwed out, because they'd fall in the dog fennel and jimson weeds under the window hole. Then we could tote 'em back, and he could use them over again. So Tom was satisfied. Then he says, "Now the thing to study out is how to get the things to Jim." "Take them in through the hole," I says, "when we get it done." He only just looked scornful, and said something about nobody ever heard of such an idiotic idea, and then he went to studying. By and by he said he had ciphered out 2 or 3 ways, but there warn't no need to decide on any of them yet. Said we'd got to post Jim first. That night we went down the lightning rod a little after 10, and took one of the candles along and listened under the window hole, and heard Jim snoring, so we pitched it in, and it didn't wake him. Then we whirled in with the pick and shovel, and in about 2 hours and a half the job was done. We crept in under Jim's bed and into the cabin, and poured around and found the candle and lit it, and stood over Jim a while and found him looking hearty and healthy, and then we woke him up gentle and gradual. He was so glad to see us, he most cried, and called us honey, and all the pet names he could think of, and was for having us hunt up a cold chisel to cut the chain off his leg with right away, and clearing out without losing any time. But Tom he showed him how unregular it would be, and set down and told him all about our plans, and how we could alter them in a minute any time there was an alarm, and not to be the least afraid, because we would see he got away sure. So Jim said it was all right, and we sat there and talked over old times a while, and then Tom asked a lot of questions, and when Jim told him Uncle Silas come in every day or two to pray with him, and Aunt Sally come in to see if he was comfortable and had plenty to eat, and both of them was kind as they could be, Tom says, "Now I know how to fix it. We'll send you some things by them." I said, "Don't do nothing of the kind. It's one of the most jackass ideas I ever struck." But he never paid no attention to me. Went right on. It was his way when he'd got his plans set. So he told Jim how we'd have to smuggle in the rope ladder pie and other large things by Nat, the nigger that fed him, and he must be on the lookout and not be surprised, and not let Nat see him open them. And we would put small things in Uncle's coat pockets, and he must steal them out. And we would tie things to Aunt's apron strings or put them in her apron pocket, if we got a chance, and told him what they would be and what they was for, and told him how to keep a journal on the shirt with his blood and all that. He told him everything. Jim, he couldn't see no sense in the most of it, but he allowed we was white folks and had knowed better than him, so he was satisfied and said he would do it all just as Tom said. Jim had plenty corn-cob pipes and tobacco, so we had a right down good sociable time. Then we crawled out through the hole, and so home to bed, with hands that looked like they'd been chawed. Tom was in high spirits. He said it was the best fun he ever had in his life, and the most intellectual, and said if he only could see his way to it, we would keep it up all the rest of our lives and leave Jim to our children to get out, for he believed Jim would come to like it better and better the more he got used to it. He said that in that way it could be strung out to as much as 80 year, and would be the best time on record, and he said it would make us all celebrated that had a hand in it. In the morning we went out to the wood pile and chopped up the brass candlestick into handy sizes, and Tom put them and the pewter spoon in his pocket. Then we went to the nigger cabins, and while I got Nat's notice off, Tom shoved a piece of candlestick into the middle of a corn pone that was in Jim's pan, and we went along with Nat to see how it would work, and it just worked noble. When Jim bit into it, it almost gnashed all his teeth out, and there warn't ever anything could have worked better. Tom said so himself. Jim, he never let on but what it was only just a piece of rock or something like that that's always getting into bread, you know, but after that he never bit into nothing but what he jabbed his fork into it in 3 or 4 places first. And whilst we was a-standing there in the diminished light, here comes a couple of the hounds bulging in from under Jim's bed, and they kept on piling in till there was 11 of them, and there warn't hardly room in there to get your breath. By jings, we forgot to fasten that lean-to door. The nigger Nate, he only just hollered, "Witches!" once, and kneeled over onto the floor amongst the dogs, and begun to groan like he was dying. Tom jerked the door open and flung out a slab of Jim's meat, and the dogs went for it, and in 2 seconds he was out himself and back again and shut the door, and I knowed he'd fixed the other door too. Then he went to work on the nigger, coaxing him and petting him and asking him if he'd been imagining he saw something again. He raised up and blinked his eyes around and says, "Ma, Sid, you'll say I's a fool, but if I didn't believe I'd see most a million dogs or devils or something, I wished I may die right here in these tracks. I did, most surely. Ma said I felt 'em. I felt 'em, sir. They was all over me. Dad fetch it. It just wish I could git my hands on one of them witches just once. Only just once. It's all I'd asked. But mostly I wish they'd let me 'lone, I does." Tom says, "Well, I tell you what I think. What makes them come here just this runaway nigger's breakfast time? It's because they're hungry. That's the reason. You make them a witch pie. That's the thing for you to do." "But my land, Ma Sid, how's I gwine make much pie? I don't know how'll make it. I ain't never hearn of sich a thing before." "Well, then I'll have to make it myself." "Will you do it, honey, will you? I'll wussip the ground in your foot, I will." "All right, I'll do it, seeing it's you, and you been good to us and showed us the runaway nigger. But you got to be mighty careful. When we come around, you turn your back, and then whatever we put in the pan, you don't let on you see it at all. And you don't look when Jim unloads the pan. Something might happen. I don't know what. And above all, don't you handle the witch things." "Handle 'em, Ma Sid? What is you talking about? I wouldn't lay the weight of my finger on 'em, not for 10,000,000,000,000,000, I wouldn't." End of chapter 36. Reading by Father Zeile of Detroit, Michigan. DRZEILE.net.
Chapter 7 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 37. That was all fixed. So then we went away and went to the rubbish pile in the backyard, where they keep the old boots and rags and pieces of bottles and wore out tin things and all such truck, and scratched around and found an old thin washpan, and stopped up the holes as well as we could to bake the pie in, and took it down cellar and stole it full of flour, and started for breakfast, and found a couple of shingle nails that Tom said would be handy for a prisoner to scrabble his name and sorrows on the dungeon walls with, and dropped one of them in Aunt Sally's apron pocket, which was hanging on a chair, and the other we stuck in the band of Uncle Silas's hat, which was on the bureau, because we had the children say their pa and ma was going to the runaway nigger's house this morning, and then went to breakfast, and Tom dropped the pewter spoon in Uncle Silas's coat pocket, and Aunt Sally wasn't come yet, so we had to wait a little while. And when she come, she was hot and red and cross, and couldn't hardly wait for the blessing. And then she went to sluicing out coffee with one hand and cracking the handiest child's head with her thimble with the other, and says, "I've hunted high and I've hunted low, and it does beat all what has become of your other shirt. My heart fell down amongst my lungs and livers and things, and a hard piece of corn crust started down my throat after it, and got met on the road with a cough, and was shot across the table, and took one of the children in the eye, and curled him up like a fishing worm, and let a cry out of him the size of a war whoop. And Tom, he turned kind of blue around the gills, and it all amounted to a considerable state of things for about a quarter of a minute, or as much as that, and I would have sold out for half price if there was a bidder. But after that we was all right again. It was the sudden surprise of it that knocked us so kind of cold. Uncle Silas, he says, it's most uncommon curious. I can't understand it. I know perfectly well I took it off because you ain't got one on. Just listen at that man. I know you took it off, and know it by a better way than your wool gathering memory too, because it was on the clothesline yesterday. I see it there myself. But it's gone. That's the long and short of it. And you'll just have to change to a red flannel one till I can get time to make a new one. And it'll be the third I've made in 2 years. It just keeps a body on the jump to keep you in shirts. And whatever you do manage to do with them is more I can make out. Anybody would think you would learn to take some sort of care of them at your time of life. I know it's Sally, and I do try all I can. But it oughtn't to be altogether my fault, because you know I don't see them nor have nothing to do with them except when they're on me, and I don't believe I've ever lost one of them off of me. Well, it ain't your fault if you haven't, Silas. You'd have done it if you could, I reckon. And the shirt ain't all that's gone, nother. That's a spoon gone, and that ain't all. There was 10, and now there's only 9. The calf got the shirt, I reckon, but the calf never took the spoon, that's certain. Why, what else is gone, Sally? There's 6 candles gone, that's what. The rats could have got the candles, and I reckon they did. I wonder they don't walk off with the whole place, the way you're always going to stop their holes and don't do it. And if they weren't fools, they'll sleep in your hair, Silas. You'd never find it out. But you can't lay the spoon on the rats, and that I know. Well, Sally, I'm in fault, and I acknowledge it. I've been remiss, but I won't let tomorrow go by without stopping up them holes. Oh, I wouldn't hurry. Next year will do. Matilda Angelina Araminta Phelps. Whack comes the thimble, and the child snatches her claws out of the sugar bowl without fooling around any. Just then, the nigger woman steps onto the passage and says, "Missus, there's a sheet gone." A sheet gone? Well, for the land's sake, I'll stop up them holes today, says Uncle Silas, looking sorrowful. Oh, do shut up. Suppose the rats took the sheet? Where's it gone, Lizzie? Glad to goodness I ain't no notion, Miss Sally. She was on the clothesline yesterday, but she done gone. She ain't done no more now. I reckon the world is coming to an end. I never see the beat of it in all my born days. A shirt, and a sheet, and a spoon, and 6 can. Missus, comes a young yellow wench, There's a brass candlestick missing. Clear out from here, you hussy. I'll take a skillet to you." Well, she was just a biling. I'd begun to lay for a chance. I reckoned I would sneak out and go for the woods till the weather moderated. She kept her raging right along, running her insurrection all by herself, and everybody else mighty meek and quiet. And at last Uncle Silas, looking kind of foolish, fishes up that spoon out of his pocket. She stopped, with her mouth open and her hands up, and as for me, I wished I was in Jerusalem or somewheres. But not long, because she says, "It's just as I expected." So you had it in your pocket all the time, and like as not, you've got the other things there too. How'd they get there? "I really don't know, Sally," he says, kind of apologizing. "Or I would tell. I was studying over my text in Acts 17 before breakfast, and I reckon I put it in there, not noticing, meaning to put my testament in, and it must be so because my testament ain't in. But I'll go and see, and if the testament is where I had it, I'll know I didn't put it in, and that will show that I laid the testament down and took up the spoon and, oh, for the land's sake, give a body a rest. Go long now, the whole kit and billing of ye, and don't come nigh me again till I've got back my peace of mind." I'd have heard her if she'd have said it to herself, let alone speaking it out, and I'd have got up and obeyed her if I'd been dead. As we was passing through the sitting room, the old man, he took up his hat, and the shingle nail fell out on the floor, and he just merely picked it up and laid it on the mantel shelf, and never said nothing, and went out. Tom see him do it, and remembered about the spoon, and says, "Well, it ain't no use to send things by him no more. He ain't reliable." Then he says, "But he done us a good turn with the spoon anyway, without knowing it, and so we'll go and do him one without him knowing it, stop up his rat holes." There was a noble good lot of them down cellar, and it took us a whole hour, but we done the job tight and good and ship. Then we had steps on the stairs, and blowed out our light and hid, and here comes the old man, with a candle in one hand and a bundle of stuff in the other, looking as absent-minded as year before last. He went a mooning around, first to one rat hole and then another, till he'd been to them all. Then he stood about 5 minutes, picking tallow drip off his candle and thinking. Then he turns off slow and dreamy towards the stairs, saying, "Well, for the life of me, I can't remember when I done it. I could have shown her now that I weren't to blame on account of the rats. But never mind, let it go. I reckon it wouldn't do no good." And so he went on a mumbling upstairs, and then we left. He was a mighty nice old man, and always is. Tom was a good deal bothered about what to do for a spoon, but he said we'd got to have it, so he took a think. When he had ciphered it out, he told me how we was to do. Then we went and waited around the spoon basket till we see Aunt Sally coming, and then Tom went to counting the spoons and laying them out to one side, and I slid one of them up my sleeve, and Tom says, "Why, Aunt Sally, there ain't but 9 spoons yet." She says, "Go long to your play and don't bother me. I know better. I counted them myself." "Well, I've counted them twice, Auntie, and I can't make but 9. She looked out of all patience, but of course she'd come to count. Anybody would. "I declare to gracious there ain't but 9, she says. "Why, what in the world plague take the things? I'll count 'em again." So I slipped back the one I had, and when she got done counting, she says, "Hang the troublesome rubbish, there's 10 now." And she looked huffy and bothered both. But Tom says, "Why, Auntie, I don't think there's 10. You numbskull, didn't you see me counting?" "I know, but, well, I'm counting 'em again." So I smooched one, and they come out 9, same as the other time. Well, she was in a tearing way, just a trembling all over. She was so mad, but she counted and counted till she got that addled she'd start to count in the basket for a spoon sometimes, and so 3 times they come out right, and 3 times they come out wrong. Then she grabbed up the basket and slammed it across the house and knocked the cat galley west, and she said, "Clear out and let her have some peace, and if we come bothering around her again betwixt that and dinner, she'll skin us." So we had the odd spoon and dropped it in her apron pocket whilst she was giving us her sailing orders, and Jim got it all right along with her shingle nail before noon. We was very well satisfied with this business, and Tom allowed it was worth twice the trouble it took, because he said now she couldn't ever count them spoons twice alike again to save her life, and wouldn't believe she'd counted them right if she did, and said that after she'd about counted her head off for the next 3 days, he judged she would give it up and offer to kill anybody that wanted her to ever count them anymore. So we put the sheets back on the line that night and stole one out of her closet, and kept on putting it back and stealing it again for a couple of days, till she didn't know how many sheets she had anymore, and she didn't care, and weren't going to bullying the rest of her soul about it, and wouldn't count them again, not to save her life. She'd rather die first. So we was all right now. As to the shirts and the sheets and the spoon and the candles, by the help of the calf and the rats and the mixed up counting. And as to the candlestick, it weren't no consequence. It would blow over by and by. But that pie was a job. We had no end of trouble with that pie. We fixed it up away down in the woods, and cooked it there, and we got it done at last, and very satisfactory too, but not all in one day, and we had to use up 3 wash pans full of flour before we got through, and we got burnt pretty much all over, in places, and eyes put out with the smoke, because you see, we didn't want nothing but a crust, and we couldn't prop it up right, and she would always cave in. But of course, we thought of the right way at last, which was to cook the ladder 2 in the pie. So then we laid in with Jim the second night, and tore up the sheet all in little strings and twisted them together. And long before daylight, we had a lovely rope that you could hang a person with. We let on it took 9 months to make it, and in the forenoon we took it down to the woods, but it wouldn't go into the pie. Being made of a whole sheet that way, there was rope enough for 40 pies if we'd have wanted them, and plenty left over for a soup or sausage or anything you choose. We could have had a whole dinner. But we didn't need it. All we needed was just enough for the pie, and so we throwed the rest away. We didn't cook none of the pies in the washpan, afraid the solder would melt. But Uncle Silas, he had a noble brass warming pan, which he thought considerable of, because it belonged to one of his ancestors, with a long wooden handle that come over from England with William the Conqueror in the Mayflower, or one of them early ships, and was hid away up garret with a lot of other old pots and things that was valuable, not on account of being any account, because they weren't, but on account of them being relics, you know. And we snaked her out, private, and took her down there. But she failed on the first pies, because we didn't know how, but she come up smiling on the last one. We took and lined her with dough, and set her in the coals, and loaded her up with rag rope, put on a dough roof, and shut down the lid, and put hot embers on top, and stood off 5 foot with the long handle, cool and comfortable, and in 15 minutes she turned out a pie that was a satisfaction to look at. But the person that eat it would want to fetch a couple of cags of toothpicks along, for if that rope ladder wouldn't crap him down to business, I don't know nothing what I'm talking about, and lay him in enough stomach ache to last him till next time too. Nat didn't look when we put the witch pie in Jim's pan, and we put the 3 tin plates in the bottom of the pan under the victuals, and so Jim got everything all right, and as soon as he was by himself, he busted into the pie and hid the rope ladder inside of his straw tick, and scratched some marks on the tin plate, and throwed it out of the window hole. End of chapter 37. '38 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, Chapter 38. Making them pence was a distressed tough job, and so was the saw. and Jim allowed the inscription was going to be the toughest of all. That's the one which the prisoner has to scrabble on the wall. But he had to have it. Tom said he'd got to. There weren't no case of a state prisoner not scrabbling his inscription to leave behind and his coat of arms. Look at Lady Jane Grey, he says. Look at Guilford Dudley. Look at old Northumberland. Why, Huck, suppose it is considerable trouble. What you going to do? How you going to get around it? Jim's got to do his inscription and coat of arms. They all do. Jim says, why, Mass Tom, I ain't got no coat of arm. I ain't got nothing but this your old shirt, and you knows I get to keep the journal on that. Oh, you don't understand, Jim. A coat of arms is very different. Well, I says, Jim's right anyway when he says he ain't got no coat of arms, because he ain't. I reckon I knowed that, Tom says, but you bet he'll have one before he goes out of this, because he's going out right, and there ain't going to be no flaws in his record. So whilst me and Jim filed away at the pens on a brickbat apiece, Jim are making his out of the brass, and I making mine out of the spoon. Tom set to work to think out the coat of arms. By and by, he said he struck so many good ones, he didn't hardly know which to take, but there was one he reckoned he'd decide on. He says, on the scutcheon we'll have a bend OR in the dexter base, a Salter Murray MURREY in the face, with a dog, count chart for common charge, and under his foot a chain embattled for slavery with a chevron VAT VERT in a chief engraved, and 3 inverted lines on a field azure AZURE, with the numeral points rampant on a dancet indented, crest a runaway nigger, sable SABLE with his bundle over his shoulder on a bar sinister, and a couple of ghouls for supporters, which is you and me. Motto Maggiore fretta, minore otto. Got it out of a book. Means the more haste, the less speed. Gee Wilkins, I says, but what does the rest of it mean? We ain't got no time to bother over that, he says. We got to dig in like all get out. Well, anyway, I says, what's some of it? What's a fess? A fess. A fess is... You don't need to know what a fess is. I'll show him how to make it when he gets to it. Shucks, Tom, I says, I think you might tell a person. What's a bar sinister? Oh, I don't know, but he's got to have it. All the nobility does. That was just his way. If it didn't suit him to explain a thing to you, he wouldn't do it. You might pump at him a week, it wouldn't make no difference. He'd got all that coat of arms business fixed. So now he started in to finish up the rest of that part of the work, which was to plan out a mournful inscription. Said Jim got to have one, like they all done. He made up a lot, and wrote them out on a paper, and read them off so. 1. Here a captive heart busted. 2. Here a poor prisoner, forsook by the world and friends, fretted his sorrowful life. 3. Here a lonely heart broke, and a worn spirit went to its rest, after 37 years of solitary captivity. 4. Here, homeless and friendless, after 37 years of bitter captivity, perished a noble stranger, natural son of Louis XIV. Tom's voice trembled whilst he was reading them, and he most broke down. When he got done, he couldn't no way make up his mind which one for Jim to scrabble onto the wall. They was all so good, but at last he allowed he would let him scrabble them all on. Jim said it would take him a year to scrabble such a lot of chalk onto the logs with a nail, and he didn't know how to make letters besides. But Tom said he would block them out for him, and then he wouldn't have nothing to do but just follow the lines. Then pretty soon he says, "Come to think, the logs ain't a going to do. They don't have log walls in a dungeon. We got to do the inscriptions into a rock. We'll fetch a rock." Jim said the rock was worse than the logs. He said it would take him such a pissing long time to dig them into the rock he wouldn't ever get out. But Tom said he would let me help him do it. Then he took a look to see how me and Jim was getting along with the pens. It was most pesky tedious hard work and slow, and didn't give my hands no show to get well off the saws, and we didn't seem to make no headway hardly. So Tom says, "I know how to fix it. We got to have a rock for the coat of arms and mournful inscriptions, and we can kill 2 birds with that same rock. There's a gaudy big grindstone down at the mill, and we'll smooch it and carve the things on it, and file out the pens and the saw on it too." It weren't no slouch of an idea, and it weren't no slouch of a grindstone nutter, but we allowed we'd tackle it. It weren't quite midnight yet, so we cleared out for the mill, leaving Jim at work. We smudged the grindstone and set out to roll her home, but it was a most nation tough job. Sometimes, do what we couldn't keep her from falling over, and she come mighty near mashing us every time. Tom said she was going to get one of us sure before we got through. We got her halfway, and then we was plumb played out and most drowned with sweat. We see it weren't no use. We get to go and fetch Jim. So he raised up his bed and slid the chain off the bed leg and wrapped it round and round his neck, and we crawled out through our hole and down there, and Jim and me laid into that grindstone and walked her along like nothing, and Tom superintended. He could out superintend any boy I ever see. He knowed how to do everything. Our hole was pretty big, but it weren't big enough to get the grindstone through. But Jim, he took the pick and soon made it big enough. Then Tom marked out them things on it with the nail, and set Jim to work on them, the nail for a chisel, and an iron bolt from the rubbish in the lean-to for a hammer, and told him to work till the rest of his candle quit on him, and then he could go to bed and hide the grindstone under his straw tick and sleep on it. Then we helped him fix his chain back on the bed leg, and was ready for bed ourselves. But Tom thought of something and says, "You got any spiders in here, Jim?" "No, sir, thanks to goodness I ain't, Master Tom." "All right, we'll get you some. But bless you, honey, I don't want none. As afraid of them, I'd just as soon have rattlesnakes around." Tom thought a minute or two and says, "It's a good idea, and I reckon it's been done. It must have been done. It stands to reason. Yes, it's a prime good idea. Where could you keep it?" "Keep what, Master Tom?" "Why, a rattlesnake." "Do goodness gracious alive, Master Tom! Why, if there was a rattlesnake to come in here, I'd take and bust right out of that log wall. I would, with my head." "Why, Jim, you wouldn't be afraid of it after a little. You could tame it." "Tame it?" "Yes, easy enough. Every animal is grateful for kindness and petting, and they wouldn't think of hurting a person that pets them. Any book will tell you that. You try. That's all I ask. Just try for 2 or 3 days. Why, you can get him so in a little while that he'll love you and sleep with you, and won't stay away from you a minute, and will let you wrap him round your neck and put his head in your mouth." "Please, Master Tom, don't talk so. I can't stand it. He'd let me shove his head in my mouth? For a favour, ain't it? I lay he'd wait with a powerful long time for I to ask him. Even more than that, I don't want him to sleep with me." "Jim, don't act so foolish. A prisoner's got to have some kind of a dumb pet, and if a rattlesnake ain't ever been tried, why, there's more glory to be gained in your being the first to ever try it than any other way you could ever think of to save your life." "Why, Master Tom, I don't want no such glory. Snake take and bite Jim's chain off, then where is the glory? No, sir, I don't want no such doings. Blame it, can't you try? I only want you to try. You needn't keep it up if it don't work. But the trouble all done if the snake bite me while I'm trying him. Master Tom, I's willing to tackle most anything that ain't unreasonable. But if you and Huck fetches a rattlesnake in here for me to tame, I's going to leave, that's sure." "Well then, let it go, let it go, if you're so bull-headed about it. We can get you some garter snakes, and you can tie some buttons on their tails, and let on their rattlesnakes, and I reckon that'll have to do. I can stand them, Master Tom, but blame if I couldn't get along without them. I tell you that. I never knowed before 'twas so much bother and trouble to be a prisoner." "Well, it always is when it's done right. You got any rats around here?" "No, sir, I ain't seen none." "Well, we'll get you some rats." "Why, Master Tom, I don't want no rats. There's the baddest and blamedest creatures to stop a body, and rustle round over them, and bite his feet when he's trying to sleep, I ever seen. No, sir. Give me the garter snakes, if I's got to have 'em, but don't give me no rats. I ain't got no use from. But Jim, you got to have 'em. They all do. So don't make no more fuss about it. Prisoners ain't ever without rats. There ain't no instance of it. And they train them and pet them and learn them tricks, and they get to be as sociable as flies. But you got to play music to them. You got anything to play music on? I ain't got nothing but a coarse comb and a piece of paper and a juice harp. But I reckon they wouldn't take no stock in a juice harp. Yes, they would. They don't care what kind of music it is. A juice harp's plenty good enough for a rat. All animals like music. In a prison, they dote on it, especially painful music, and you can't get no other kind out of a juice harp. It always interests them. They come out to see what's the matter with you. Yes, you're all right. You're fixed very well. You want to set on your bed nights before you go to sleep, and early in the mornings, and play your juice harp. Play The Last Link is Broken. That's the thing that will scoop a rat quicker than anything else. And when you've played about 2 minutes, you will see all the rats, and the snakes, and spiders, and things begin to feel worried about you and come, and they'll just fairly swam over you and have a noble good time. Yes, they will, I reckon, Master Tom. But what kind of time is Jim having? Blessed if I can see the point. But I'll do it if I got to. I reckon I better keep the animals satisfied, and not have no trouble in the house. Tom waited to think it over, and see if there wasn't nothing else, and pretty soon he says, "Oh, there's one thing I forgot. Could you raise a flower here, do you reckon?" "I don't know, but maybe I could, Master Tom. But it's tolerable dark in here, and I ain't got no use for no flower, nohow, and should be a powerful sight of trouble." "Well, you try it anyway. Some other prisoners has done it. One of them big cat-tail looking mullen stalks could grow in here, Master Tom, I reckon, but she wouldn't be worth half the trouble she'd cause. Don't you believe it. We'll fetch you a little one, and you plant it in the corner over there and raise it. And don't call it mullen, call it picciola. That's its right name when it's in a prison, and you want to water it with your tears." "Why, I got plenty spring water, Master Tom." "You don't want spring water, you want to water it with your tears. It's the way they always do." "Why, Master Tom, I lay I can raise one of them mullen stalks twist with the spring water, whilst another man's a starting one with tears." "That ain't the idea. You got to do it with tears." "She'll die on my hands, Master Tom. She surely will, 'cause I don't scarcely ever cry." So Tom was stumped, but he studied it over, and then said Jim would have to worry along the best he could with an onion. He promised he would go to the nigger cabins and drop one, private, in Jim's coffee pot in the morning. Jim said he would just as soon have tobacco in his coffee, and found so much fault with it, and with the work and bother of raising the mullen, and juice harping the rats, and petting and flattering up the snakes and spiders and things, on top of all the other work he had to do on pens and inscriptions and journals and things which made it more trouble and worry and responsibility to be a prisoner than anything he ever undertook, that Tom most lost all patience with him, and said he was just loaded down with more gaudier chances than a prisoner ever had in the world to make a name for himself, and yet he didn't know enough to appreciate them, and they was just about wasted on him. So Jim, he was sorry, and said he wouldn't behave so no more, and then me and Tom shoved for bed. End of chapter 38.